So my name is Kirk Monroe. I go by the handle Poshaholic, Poshaholic on Twitter, Poshaholic@gmail.com, Poshaholic@hotmail.com. If you're going to contact me by email, use Gmail because I check that one more often. And my website's poshaholic.com. And I grabbed that name over 10 years ago when I kind of got bit by the PowerShell bug. And because back then I was a software dev focused on MAPI and LDAP programming against Exchange and Active Directory. And I went to what they called the Exchange 12 Airlift, because this was pre-Exchange, before it was called 2007. It was named Exchange 12. And Microsoft had this airlift event in Redmond, and so I was working for Quest Software, and they sent me out there to kind of see what was coming down the pipe. And that's where I first met Jeffrey Stover, and I saw presentations about PowerShell, and I just felt these light bulbs going on in my head. And after going through many years of trying to wrap my head around the mental model of the dev who created the API that I'm working with, and just seeing PowerShell and the consistency it had, and the discoverability that was built in, and it seemed like a language that was intentionally built really well from the ground up. I loved it, and so I just kind of redirected my career over it after starting tinkering with it a little bit. Worked on the Power GUI team. Power GUI, for people who haven't been around PowerShell that long, is one of the early PowerShell editors, and we also had an admin console. So I worked on the Power GUI team for about 6 years, just about, before the product got canceled. And the reason it got canceled was because it was a free product, and in a company that was focusing on where are our $20+ million per year revenue products. And so when it came time to restructure and make cuts, free products were the easy ones to cut. So although we had a commercial version, but it was really not a fit for the kind of business that this company was looking for. So they cut the product and the team, and so I hopped around a bunch of different companies since then, before I settled into Learn on Demand, where I am now. So I've been doing PowerShell hardcore for 10 years, and these days I still do a lot of PowerShell, but PowerShell is absolutely not the focus of my work anymore, although it's amazing how much building that foundation, it comes into my work all the time, whether it's influence from automation into the things I'm doing, and my personal drive to, and interest into doing things in a streamlined and sleek fashion with the least amount of clicks possible. And that influences directly UI designs I come up with and features I suggest to this company I'm working for. And then, of course, there is PowerShell opportunities to tie in for scripting, and I got a PowerShell module I use at work, and we have extensibility points that we push in that use PowerShell, and so I still do a lot of PowerShell, but it's just not my focus. My focus more, it's moved into a broader role where I think about, just learning solutions. How do you learn technologies? That's because at Learn on Demand Systems, our main focus is on helping people learn tech. And so if you ever travel to Microsoft Ignite, or before that, back when it was TechEd, or if you go to the Microsoft Build conference and you go to the areas where there's hands-on labs, the platform that serves those hands-on labs is Learn on Demand Systems, and those are the guys I work with, which is really, it's a fun job because it's all about online learning, and that's something I'm very big into. So that's enough of a ramble about me. So as part of the work that I've been doing with Learn on Demand Systems, I'm looking at a lot of new technologies all the time because I need to keep ahead of what's coming down the pipe. And while doing that, I have that natural inclination towards all things PowerShell and automation in general. And so one of the things I had to look at for work was Azure Functions, which fall into this serverless computing, I'm doing finger quotes here that you can't see, but serverless computing catchphrase. And when I first heard that term, I said to myself, that's just ridiculous, because it makes no sense, serverless computing. Because of course there's a server. How else do you get computing without the server? Which is true. But I get now, after having dug into it a lot more and looking at how it fits into the tool chains that are used by developers, by DevOps, by IT pros across the board, how that makes a difference and how the core concept applies, it really makes a lot of sense. And so what it's all about is serverless computing is all about creating solutions that normally in the past you would have had to deploy a server and manage a server and keep that solution available on that server at all times. And taking that and pulling the server parts out of it, and so all you have left is just a solution. And that solution is available still all the time as if it was running on a server, but it's not running until you call it. And that's where the serverless part comes in, because Azure and virtualized infrastructure and compute and network and storage resources, when you call into a serverless endpoint like an Azure function, Azure wakes up and says, oh, you want to run this thing that's going to do something for you. Well, I know that I need to deploy that onto this type of virtual machine or into this type of container, or it doesn't really matter the back end, it's kind of a black box to us, but I just need to take this and put this inside of something that it'll run and make it available to you. And then so that's on a cold start. When I'm talking about Azure Functions right now and the way this works, there are several different ways you can use Azure Functions, and this is basically the way the free tier works. The free tier, it just sits there in a cold state, undeployed, waiting for somebody to say, hey, wake up, I need you to do something. And so when somebody comes in and says, hey, I want you to do something for me, then it wakes up, and Azure will stand up the virtual hardware that's needed, whether it's a container or a VM or a combination of those things, and deploy the Azure function into that hardware, and then run the thing that you called that you were originally trying to run. And so that's the cold start, and that can take a little bit of time for that first cold start. And then you can run it again, and boom, it runs right away, because it's at that point it's hot, it's live, and it'll stay live for a period of time until it's falls into an inactive state where it's not really being used often enough. And I don't exactly have my head wrapped around how long that is. I haven't measured it myself. I'm sure there's documentation on it somewhere, but I just haven't had the need to dig into it. But after you don't use it for a while, then Azure realizes, oh, this resource isn't really being used, so I'm just going to take that Azure function, yank it out of there, deprovision the virtual hardware, and then let it go and sit silent again until I call it again. And so instead of paying for resources and managing those resources all the time, which, I mean, absolutely in the past, if this was an on-premise server or even an on-premise virtual machine, it would very, very likely be a very underused resource unless the payload, the work that you were doing was something that you were doing a whole lot in your environment. And so it does away with all that and moves to more shared infrastructure and deploying these things that you can run and do cool stuff. So that's cool in and of itself, and that explains kind of serverless computing in a nutshell. And by the way, if anybody has questions, I have the chat window here open beside me, so feel free to fire in a question if you want, or just come off of mute and interrupt me, and I'm cool with that. So that's serverless computing, which is interesting. And then, then you peel back, then you need to go look at, okay, well, what can Azure Functions do? And so when I talk about Azure Functions, there's two terms. There's Azure Function Apps, and there's Azure Functions. An Azure Function App is a deployment that contains one or more Azure Functions. There's lots of reasons why you might want to do that. For the same reason that you might want to package up a lot of PowerShell functions that are related inside of a single PowerShell module, you might want to package up a lot of Azure Functions that are related inside of an Azure Function App. So that's the easiest way that I can find probably to relate those two. You could have an Azure Function App that only has a single function. You can have an Azure Function App that has dozens of functions. It just depends on the need. So what I've got right here in front of me, this is my own personal Azure portal, and I'm in a blank slate, and I'm looking at the Azure Function Apps service, and you can see I've got no function apps to display. Part of the reason for that is because I was tinkering around with some stuff I was going to show you, and I thought I could do it pre-configured, and then I goofed something up, and I didn't really know how to gracefully fix it in time to start this, and I thought, well, you know what, this is just something telling me go back to a clean slate and walk you through it from ground zero, which is probably better anyway, since this is an introductory talk about Azure Functions. You're going to, as I go through this, there are probably going to be questions that I don't know the answer to, because Azure Functions, there's a lot that you can do, and there's probably things that I'm not going to talk about. I know there's things that I'm not going to talk about at all, because, like I mentioned, it's a lot. But what I want to do is I want to show this to you at an introductory level, just to get a feel for, just to give you a feel for what you can do with these things and why they're important. Normally, if I was standing in front of a room, I would say, show of hands, how many people who are listening in have done anything with Azure Functions or are already tinkering around with this. Maybe just throw something in, like a +1 or something into the chat. If you guys are you already working with Azure Functions? I'm just curious. Or is this net new? So just +1 if it's net new. Brand new. Yeah, Mike, you're tinkering with them. New to a lot of people, that's what I figured. Yeah, okay, so good. So then what I planned for this talk was appropriate for that, because I figured that this was new. I also figured this was probably new to a lot of people because, well, one, it hasn't been around for that long, and it takes a while for technology to kind of just fall into people's mental model of how they can use it. And two, when I asked people if anybody had any questions about Azure Function Apps, nobody had any questions, and I wasn't surprised at that. I figured that meant that people just aren't into it yet, which is just fine. So let me get into the actual creation of these guys. So when you come in here, a lot of the Azure services that are on the left-hand side, storage accounts and whatever, I can click on the actual container once I've actually got it show up in my favorites, and I can come in here and click create. But Azure Function Apps doesn't have that. I sent a tweet out to them the other day suggesting it would be great if they had a create button here. So if you want to create one, you have to actually come and click on the new, and then function. I usually just type in function and find function app to create a new function app. And so that's just going to allow me to create a new function app. And I don't need to put any input on the first page. I'll put my input in the next one. So I'm just going to call this, these names that you give your function app have to be globally unique, because they are using a public Azure websites.net name. So you have to come up with something that is globally unique. And I think this one is the one I was trying before. Yeah, that's fine. So I'm going to do that, and I've already got a resource group created from before. So let me just pick a few things here, and then I'll speak to it. And that still exists. Yeah, so we like the existing one. So all I'm doing right here is creating a new Azure function app. In my case, I'm calling it PS Serverless, or PowerShell Serverless. And it has to be in a resource group. And I pick my location, and it has to have a storage group associated with it, because for the files, that's going to be work that are behind the actual deployment. But that's pretty much it. You can turn the application insights on if you want to. I recommend doing that only if you already know what application insights are and how they work. If you're just getting started, run with application insights off. You can turn it on later. The reason I make that recommendation is because application insights can be overwhelming, because they're insights into what's running inside of a software package inside of Azure, and they can be a little bit focused and overwhelming with all of the things that show up inside of their dashboard. So for starters, just run with that guy off, and then know that you can actually turn it on later. And there's a blog post on Microsoft about how to do that. Hosting plan is the only thing really weird about or different about this one here. And so there are different consumption. There's two different types of hosting plans. There's consumption and there's app service. Consumption is free, means you're going to run on shared hardware. If you're going to start tinkering with Azure Functions, do that, because you're just tinkering with it, trying to learn it, figure out how it works. App service plan, you can actually go in and pick a paid tier that you would decide on based on how much RAM you want, what kind of CPU you want, just like you would for an Azure virtual machine, as well as what kind of load do you want to support in terms of scale out? How many simultaneous executions do you want to have of your function? If those things are important to you, as well as being always hot, so app service plans are always hot, then go into the app service plan. For starters, and even for a good amount of initial use of these guys, you might find consumption suit your fancy, so I would recommend just starting there. So let me just click on create and get that guide going. So that'll just take a second. And while that does, I'm just going to take a bite of my pumpkin pie because it was Thanksgiving in Canada yesterday. And I have leftovers. So, I see there's some questions coming in, but nothing yet, so that's fine. I'll wait till they come in. So it's going in there. It's already gone deployed. So it deploys my function. Now you notice when it says the deployment, even though I called it PS serverless, it shows this deployment Microsoft.function app and then some kind of a GUID looking thing. Don't worry about the fact that it shows a weird name. It deploys it like you would expect to, such that when you actually visit the resource, you go into your function apps service, and then you can see your actual function app with the name that you gave it. I think behind the scenes it's using an obscure name that just identifies what that function is, and then you can, when it deploys it, it deploys it using the name that you specified. So that's fine. You can just don't worry about the fact that it shows a weird name. And so now I've got one function app, but it does not have any functions yet. Before I get into creating functions, I should talk about why this is important. So one of the things, so my background, as I mentioned before, I used to do a lot of development work, and then most of the development work that I've done in my career has been around software for IT pros, and to this day that hasn't changed. And I've done a lot of IT, well, I guess I get the IT mindset, and I've done a lot of IT work through PowerShell, but as a developer in various roles, and I'm working on software for IT pros as well. One of the things, so you guys probably know that there are 2 PowerShell commandlets that are inside of native PowerShell for invoking APIs on the web. There's invoke web request, and there's invoke REST method. And those are really cool because those allow us to call out to APIs that some service shares on the internet. And it doesn't really matter. I mean, Azure has REST API endpoints. So many services out there have REST documentation and endpoints that we can use to do stuff inside of this cloud service, and yet still call it from our PowerShell and do automation and DevOps work around that. So that's great. Well, then there's also situations where some services call out. So some services have an extension point where you can get that service to call out to a REST endpoint. And that's where you can set up integrations. So that could be through a webhook. So GitHub supports webhooks, as does Slack, and you can set up webhooks that those services at the right point in time will call out to the destination or the target that webhook is configured to use, and that allows. And so if you're a developer in the past and you want to set up kind of an endpoint, or you wanted to create something that has some extension around GitHub or Slack or whatever, you could do that by creating something that has a REST API and setting up that endpoint, and then you could actually call into it and do some work, which is great. But that's dev stuff. Azure Functions make it brain dead simple to create REST APIs that can be invoked directly using invoke REST method, that can be invoked via other software that you want to make a call into a REST API endpoint. Normally, especially in the world of online services, if you want to hook into something that's online and its notion of integration is via REST and REST endpoints and calling things, as far as PowerShell goes, if you're a PowerShell guy, you're like, oh, well, I'm SOL because, you know, I can write PowerShell code, but what can I do with actually doing REST APIs? I'd have to have a developer for that. Well, not anymore. So that's a huge draw, and that's one of the reasons why I would recommend trying to get in front of this serverless movement, because I feel like that's got a lot of power and that's got a lot of potential to add longevity to your PowerShell skill set in the world that moves more and more into online services that talk to one another. And so as PowerShell people, we're all used to doing automation and DevOps type work and sometimes integration work with on-premise stuff, on-premises hardware, and that makes sense. And that's how traditional computing has been done. But now being able to work into the online world and dealing with REST APIs that can call into an endpoint that internally is running PowerShell that then does something else. Maybe it does something in Azure, maybe it does something in some other cloud service, maybe it just stores information for logging, all sorts of different things. Well, you can actually do that now, and you can still do it leveraging your PowerShell skills. So that's a thing, and that's worth getting in front of the bus for this one, because serverless computing is going to help you extend your skill set beyond on-premises management of resources, beyond management from your local environment into external resources. It'll extend it now into being able to hook in from external resources coming into your code to do things, which is great. And then there's also other serverless computing stuff, pieces that are coming together in Azure that go and add more value on this. And so understanding how those work is worthwhile. So logic apps. Logic apps is a great example. Logic apps, it's kind of like, if you guys remember PowerShell workflow, and so if you know that and you know the notion of workflow with a drag and drop UI where you connect different pieces to one another, then I can go into logic apps and show that if I've got some time, depending on how tired I get, we'll see. But at any rate, or that could be another talk. Logic apps allow you to create this flowchart-like diagram that can invoke Azure functions. And so if you guys know the web service out there, IFTTT, if this then that, is that right? IFTTT, if this then that. Yeah, that's right. So that service is all about creating these little micro recipes that if I got an email with this subject line in my Office 365 mailbox, then go and do this thing. And so that also traditionally has fallen under the dev umbrella. But now there's well, in particular with logic apps in Azure, there are a ton of things that you can already hook into through just little point-and-click widgets where you indicate, okay, I'm gonna use the integration with Slack or with Office 365 or with whatever different services, and there's a whole lot of them that are supported. And then as outputs, I want to call into my Azure function to do something because the thing I want to do is not already done yet inside of a widget. Or the other way around, maybe you want to use your logic app as the input into use your function app as an input into a logic app. And so you can do these kind of integrations. And so you're broadening your skill set without having to think I'm going into the dark side of software development, and that's cool to me. And then another place that there are the serverless computing and integrations that we can use is with event grid subscriptions. And so these two by themselves, function apps and logic apps, they're in Azure, but that's it. They don't have anything specifically to do with Azure. It doesn't matter. Azure is just the platform that they run on. They could have been running on a server. They could be, these really have nothing Azure specific about them, other than that they're services that are running inside of Microsoft Azure. But you don't have to be an Azure user with Azure resources like storage accounts and databases and virtual machines and stuff. You don't have to have any of that to get the value from these guys. These guys are just by themselves a tool that you can run PowerShell code on in a serverless fashion, which is really, really cool. And then if you do use Azure, well, then you can get some extra stuff too, where you can tie into these things, because you can leverage this event grid subscriptions piece, which is an event handler that allows you to subscribe to an event. For example, inside of resource group, whatever, whenever a resource is deleted, I want it to call into a REST endpoint. Oh, but I'm not a developer, I can't write that. Well, yes, you can, because you can write a function app, and then you can do that code inside of PowerShell. So that's all really awesome. So there's just opportunities around serverless computing and adding the concepts behind it to your automation skills that you already have. That's enough spiel about that. I sound like I'm a marketing guy for Microsoft, and I'm not. I just think this is really cool. And I mean, this is one of those things where it's early. Even though Logic Apps were officially GA, or sorry, not Logic Apps, I keep getting terms mixed up. Even though Function Apps went officially GA in late 2016, they've been around for about 2 years now, give or take. And Logic Apps are newer than that, and Events Grid subscriptions are newer than that. And this is new stuff that I think is advantageous, like I would have recommended somebody getting on that PowerShell train in 2006, version 1, because that was groundbreaking, lots of cool things you can do. PowerShell is now well established, it's cross-platform. If you already know PowerShell and you're using it, you're getting tons of value from it, but this by itself isn't it new. So, as I said, enough marketing spiel. So let me get into the actual function app here and actually create some functions. So as far as this UI goes, just to let you know where some things are. When you're looking at your function app itself, you get your function app name up here, and in your overview, you can stop it, so you can totally stop it from running altogether and restart it because it's a web service, and so it functions like a web service. So you can stop it and you can restart it. You can download a profile so you can publish to it, and then you can publish to it a number of different ways. Doug Fink, you guys probably know him, another PowerShell MVP out of New York. He's been MVP for 8 years. He's got a module, and actually, the timing of all this is so funny. And the fact that Mike wanted he was looking for topics for the user group, and I said, sure, I'll do it, and October was great, and then what kind of topics, and we just kind of fell on Azure Functions because I've been doing a lot of stuff with them, and so that just kind of came together. Well, Doug Fink did a talk on Azure Functions at the New York PowerShell User Group last night, and right now in New York, started 2 days ago, it goes until the end of the day tomorrow, there is a serverless conference going on. And so the serverless movement's big enough that there's actually a conference that's grown up around it. And serverless isn't just Azure. Amazon Web Services have their own serverless infrastructure and solutions, and I'm sure Google Cloud Platform does as well. I haven't dug into it. And there's just a lot of serverless things going on that are cool that allow you to get stuff done without worrying about backend pieces. So at any rate, yeah, if you want to find a PowerShell way to deploy functions into Azure, then go look at Doug Fink's module. I'm just going to go through and do it manually using the UI right now. And so there's just some stuff here, basic settings, and you can see that the URL is psserverless.azurewebsites.net for my actual function app. And then I'm just going to hop over here to platform features. There's a lot of features inside here. And so when I talked about lots of things I'm not going to talk about, a lot of this is stuff I'm not going to talk about. But there's a lot of features and customizability in here. I don't necessarily have a great handle on how many of these things apply specifically to the PowerShell parts, or maybe some of them are more dev focused. Some of these things are just linked to more to settings. So when I set this up for the free tier, I can get to my app service plan to see them actually on that free consumption tier by clicking here. If I have quotas, I can go look at my quotas. So some of these things are just setting related. Other things are stuff that you are going to care about and want to use, like Kudu, which is advanced tools. Kudu gives you a PowerShell console on an Azure Function App endpoint server. So you can look at the system, use get child item, look where the files are, upload files to it, all those things you can do using Kudu. So that's a resource that you're going to want to take a look at and get used to, and I'll try to touch base on it. But I don't want to take too much away from just showing some functions. So aside from the platform features, deploying a function, you just got to click on the plus sign when you're creating your first function, and you'll get presented with this UI. Now, this UI makes it look like there's no PowerShell because, as you can see here, C#, JavaScript, F#, or Java, and I can pick a couple of different API types. But this is a wizard for some basic introductory stuff that is not in preview or experimental. These are all in supported published languages and supported published scenarios. If you want to go into PowerShell, look at this little footnote for PowerShell, Python, and Batch, create your own function. And it's nice you can be on PowerShell, Python, and Batch, and these four. There's more languages as well. So what I usually do when I come in here is I just skip all this stuff and I go right down to either the custom function, which is the same thing as this, create your own custom function. I usually just go directly to one of those two. So let me get into that. Now this shows me in all, so in all languages in the core scenario. Now that's a little bit misleading. When you're looking at what kind of functions you can create here, if this has all languages and you take the scroll bar and you go down looking through it, and there's JavaScript, and there's F# and there's C#, and so you can see all those, but there's no PowerShell. Well, that's because PowerShell is not considered a core scenario yet. PowerShell is in the experimental scenario. So if you want to see PowerShell, you need to do one of two things. Either filter to just PowerShell, or go to scenario and pick experimental. And then you're going to see all the PowerShell things. If you do it this way, just experimental, you see PowerShell, Batch, Python, TypeScript. That's all stuff that's currently considered new and experimental and subject to change, versus the core scenarios are published and working. One comment that I'll make that's interesting. So they've got this PowerShell under experimental, these different types. Let me filter the language here. So under PowerShell, I can create 3 different types of Azure functions, and that's all considered experimental. I can also, because I'm a developer, I can also create a C# function that calls PowerShell, and that falls under not experimental. That falls under core, because I can create a C# function under. Why is that still showing experimental? Bear with me a minute. Go back to core. Yeah, so I can create an HTTP trigger, which is a REST endpoint in C#, and my C# function calls into PowerShell, and I can do some work, and I've done that for a number of reasons. But I'm not supported yet. PowerShell itself, the actual endpoints, the actual functions that you can create are considered experimental. Minor detail, I just want to mention it in case you want to push out something that runs PowerShell that's supported. You can just throw a little C# around it and do that, and that's just fine. So there's 3 different types, core types of functions, and these 3 types map to the 3 things that you saw on the previous page in the wizard, where there were the 3 big squares. There's an HTTP trigger. That's basically a REST endpoint. There's a timer trigger, so a scheduled task, and there's a queue trigger. And queue triggers are triggered when you, they basically watch an Azure queue for a message, and then they process that message. And there's reasons why you would, different areas why you would want to use each of these. Running on a schedule, I think, is the most obvious. I'm not going to go through that. You guys can take a look at the options. That's just going to give you, you can create a function that runs on a schedule, and that does something from Azure instead of doing it from a scheduled task on a Windows server. In a nutshell, that's it. It doesn't really get more complicated than that. The other 2 are a bit more special, so those are the ones I want to talk about. So let's go with the really basic one first here. Oh, and by the way, these guys here, when you see HTTP trigger, time trigger, queue trigger, these are the inputs that cause the function to run, the trigger. So an HTTP call will cause the function to run. A timer will cause a function to run, or a queue message will cause a function to run because it's watching that queue. You can change these after you create the function. This is just to get started. So when I click on HTTP trigger, I'm going to go and name my function. One moment while I get my, I've got some code here in another window. So let's just go very simple here. Let's just go with the files one. So I'm going to name my function files, and you can pick a number of different authorization levels. You can make them anonymous, so anyone can call them, which you can do at your own risk. Anybody who knows the endpoints there can call them. Obviously, if they don't know the endpoint, they'd have to find out about it. Generally speaking, that'll get you so far because it'll get you a good distance. Because with the free tier, you get a large number of free executions. I forget how many it is, but I want to say like 200,000 or something. It's like a huge number of executions of your function that can run within a given month before you would start getting cost. It is a large number, but I still would recommend sticking with some kind of authorization that requires you to use a key to run it, just because that's a safer way to go. And so you can either require an admin, or you can just go with the function key. And generally speaking, I haven't had any need to do anything other than the function key at this point, so which is the default, and so just go with that. So let me click on create. So that's going to go and build up my function. Now, when you build it, you're going to get, right off the bat, you're going to get a run.ps1. That's your function body. So I don't see, like in normal PowerShell, you know, where I would see function, files, and then whatever. I don't see that stuff, but just imagine that's there. Imagine this looks like that, okay? And then the rest of this is just the internal part. Parameters are a little different. There's no param statement with values to this guy, because I'm not calling it like I would call a PowerShell function. Instead of parameters, you actually get your parameter input from either from the body of the request that came in, or as query parameters that are on the HTTP, that are part of the HTTPS URL. And I'll show you examples of both of those. So let me just take this, and I'm going to just copy and paste on top of it my own code, which looks a lot like this, but it's slightly different. And so there. So this is my function. And so the function, all I wanted to do, when you're tinkering around with Azure Functions and serverless computing, and you're working with a deployment on some kind of an unknown hardware piece, it can be useful to know where things are in the file system in your functions, because you might want to reference stuff in the file system. A good example of that, when you might want to reference a file, well, maybe you're going to store data locally for some reason, or maybe you want to use a module, because of course we have the PowerShell gallery, which is just chock full of PowerShell modules, and you might want to take one of those modules and get that in here. How do I get that module from the gallery into my Azure Function dynamic deployment that gets pushed on demand onto some, that's kind of confusing. How do I make that work? Well, you need to add the module to the file system that's sitting behind this guy, because when you create an Azure function, it has a storage account with a file share, and inside the file share, there's structure where you can actually put stuff. And so you need to put your modules that you would want to use from your Azure function inside the file system, and then load them from the file system. And so knowing how that works, you kind of need to know path and structure. So what this guy does is it takes a single parameter called path. It's actually set up to do two things right now. It'll take the path parameter either from the body, so you guys know probably, if let me clear my screen here, how I could do invoke REST method, REST method, and then the method I'm going to call, let's say, call get, and then the URI, and then that will be, well, actually, you know what? I'm just going to, why don't I type all this thing all over again, because that's silly. Here. So let me, I'm going to make that bigger. There, that's probably better. So we'll be down a little bit. So if I want to invoke a REST method, and I want to call it with the get method, and I've got this URL, and that's like, I'm passing in a key because this is my Azure function that I'm going to call. And then I can pass in a parameter as part of the body using a hash table. So that's one way you can pass in a parameter. And that's what this piece right here at the top is all about. And before I change my code, by default, the boilerplate gives you that same logic. So you see right off the bat, when you create one of these guys, you've got request body.name. Well, name is your parameter. So in this case, name is my path, right? It's just looking for a value called name. So I could pass in body with a hash table, name equals whatever, and call this guy. But I actually changed that, and actually I'm looking for path. So I've got request body.path. So that hopefully makes sense for people. No questions so far, so that's all good. So yeah, so that's request body.path. These you don't have, notice I don't have to create this guy. I'm just getting the inside of your function. You call get content on a file, but the file is this request REQ. That's set up automatically for you. So when you are working with REST endpoint, REQ is your incoming content from the request that was made to call you. And when you're dealing with REST endpoints, if you guys ever use REST to go and get data, you're probably well aware that you're often dealing with JSON. And so you need to use the convert to JSON, convert from JSON sometimes if you're convert to if you're passing in JSON input sometimes, and convert from when you're getting your output back from the results of invoke REST method. Well, you need to use convert from JSON inside here because my where am I going to go? My hash table here gets automatically converted into JSON by the invoke REST method commandlet, and then internally in my function, I need to take it from the JSON format, and then I can convert it back into some kind of an object. So it converts it into request body, and then I can reference that path to get my actual path. So that's what that's all about, that first piece. This second piece, you notice that says for post, but you can also do it for get. So that's they show you post method. This is a way to get your content from post method, but you can also pass content this way for get. In this case, I would call it a get method, and I'm passing in a body, and it still goes through just fine. That's okay. You can also, if you are invoking a get method, you can pass parameters as part of the actual URL. And so I will show you guys this example, and I'm going to actually run this later. Here is another example where I invoke a REST method called post, well, methods post, and it's at this URL, and it's in queue, and I'm going to add this function here in a moment. And it takes a parameter called ID with a value of 1701 and a parameter called action with a value of create. And so I can pass in parameters to a get call this way. I could have passed in my path for this guy in this kind of a format, as long as I'm willing to take the value of path and make sure it's URL encoded, so it's going to pass through fine. In my opinion, this is easier. Oh, sorry, not that one. This is easier because I don't need to do any fancy encoding for this. So that's why I chose this approach for the call. So this is my code. It's going to check for a path parameter in the message body. It's also going to check for a path parameter on the query string. It's going to default to it on the query string, which that's just the default way the code was written when it was pasted in here by the function I created. I could decide I don't like that. I wanted to actually just use the message body and get rid of this altogether. You can decide when you guys create these guys what you want. Maybe I want to make this function only accept a parameter as part of the query string. Maybe I wanted to check for the parameter inside the body, and if it doesn't find it, so maybe I want to do if string is null for empty path, and if I have a query path on the command line, then go and get that path from my command line query parameters. And so I don't have to, as far as query parameters go being encoded, I don't have to decode. The decoding is done for me. And I'll get my parameter as a string value. All I'm doing is I'm stripping off any white space in case the person was trying to be a jerk and threw a lot of additional white space around the path parameter because they wanted to muck me up. I'm doing a little bit of cleanup, tidying up on my inputs, basically making sure that my path does not have any leading or trailing white space, regardless of how I get it. But other than that, this is all just about getting my input. So I get my input, then I make sure I have something. If I don't have anything, well, I want to go with a default. And the default I'm going with a d:\\. The reason why I'm going with d:\/ is because I know that on every Azure function deployment, my files are on the D drive. And so that's why I'm defaulting to D. And then all I do is I click a child item on my path, and I send my output to a file, and the file I send the output to is $res. And that variable is set for me. I don't have to worry about it. So when you want to send something back to the caller, and you get this in the default code. So if I, just for contrast, just for comparing contrast here, hang on, let me save this because I don't want to go back and forth between the two different formats too much. So let me create a new one. Whoops. And again, PowerShell HTTP. And this time I'm going to call this one vars. And so, yeah, that's fine. And then create. And so here, you notice in the boilerplate template that you get, it shows you out file, encoding is ASCII, the file path is $res. So $res is this file that will be written to with whatever you want, and whatever you write to that file is going to be sent back to the caller automatically for you in string format. Not in JSON, in string. If you want object data that you want to convert to JSON so that then they can convert from JSON and work with objects, you want to make sure that whatever you pipe into this guy, or whatever you pass in as your input object parameter, is the content that you converted to JSON. So that's on you. Otherwise, it's just text. It's ASCII text, and it sends it back to the caller, and away it goes. So let me go back to the file over here. So this is my file's endpoint. That's all that I need as far as a function body goes. It allows me to get my child item. And I'm going to go and show you what these three pieces here are. So when you create an Azure function, the top level is your function itself. You can run it. And the way you run it, when you run it, it's going to take in parameters. It's going to use these test parameters that are over here. So fly out this panel, and if you look at the test node, this shows me that if I click on run, it's going to invoke a post method, and it's going to pass in this as my request body. And that's no good to me because I don't have a name parameter. That doesn't make sense. So in this case, I want to come over here and put in path, and maybe I want to set that path to d:\/ wait, I had it. There it is. Yeah. So it's d:\/ home /site /www group. That's my value. And so when I create a function, one of the first things I will do, just in terms of testing it, I don't want to deal with invoke web request wrong or invoke REST method wrong and some stupid human errors on my side. I want to let the Azure function UI work for me. So I'll put my parameters over here that I'm expecting right in here, and I will use write output to actually log useful information. So you guys know old school debugging where you just output to write host, for example, if you want to put up some text to see how far it gets or what the value is, some variable. Well, you can use write output, and when you use write output, anything that you output gets recorded as a log for the invocation of the function. And so let me just click on run here without going any further. And so if you look down here at the bottom, it shows function started, starting files. So that's my message, starting files, end quote. Convert from JSON unrecognized escape sequence. And so it doesn't like this because in JSON you need to, whoops, hang on. You need double backslash in JSON, your backslashes. And so it didn't like that. It was telling me right off the bat, unrecognized escape sequence, and it showed me that the value I passed in had some weird escapes going on. That's because backslash is an escape character in JSON. So look, I even get some PowerShell error code, just as if I ran it in my own session. So that's why this is really, really, really cool. And so now I've gone and made my change for that in my JSON, and now let's try it again. So I can come down here and click run down here, or I can click run here. Oh, and note this. This shows me what the result came back that was sent back from the function, an internal server error, as well as the actual ID of the actual invocation, the request ID, the status code was 500, and then the message exception while executing function, and then a lot of text that goes, well, not a lot, that goes towards the edge of the screen. That same text is the text that showed up inside the error message over here. So I'm just going to click on run here again. And there, see it's going again, running, starting files, and then retrieving file listing, ending files, and it completed successfully. And my status is 200 OK. And if I look at my output here, I can see it's string output, And it looks a little weird, the output, because the way that this works through the UI is they actually show you \r\n like they're almost like they're escaped like JSON values are. And so that's just new lines. And then I can see directory, and here's the directory path with double backslashes, again, because of escape characters. And then there's the headings, mode, last write time, length, name. And it's all on a single line, which is really annoying to me. And so I want them to change that for PowerShell, because that doesn't make any sense to a PowerShell person to see the output that way with \r/n as actual physical values in the output. I have a long post on GitHub because Azure Functions and their runtime is open source. And so they have a repository where you can post issues. And if you go to this GitHub/Azure, actually, let me just do it this way since we're on a meeting, a chat window. If you go here, well, actually, you know what? I'll give you the whole thing if you want to read the whole thing. If you go to that link, that is a post I made that talks about the design flaws in the PowerShell implementation, in the experimental implementation of PowerShell in Azure Functions today. And so there's lots of different things that I recommend here from the work I've done. And so that's what that is all about. And I think in there it talks about, yeah, here I'm talking about the output. And so that's, yeah, there's just feedback in here about stuff that they should do. And if you like it and agree and you want to come and thumbs up it, that's great. They'll know that that people are agreeing with it and maybe prioritize that higher. As it goes right now, PowerShell is on the radar, but priority is based on demand. If people aren't using it that much, then that's not going to have as much of a high priority, and so that's how they work. But that's fine. It will get there eventually. The need is there, and PowerShell in Azure Functions is a big deal. So anyway, this shows you that it works. So now I've got it working inside here. Oh, notice that one important note. It picked post by default. If I change this to get, and then I run it again, it goes and runs, and it still completes successfully. And the reason why that, oh, and if I want to make sure, because this is like a whole lot of input down here, I can just clear this guy, and then I can run it again to check out this, you know, each run by itself. And so it ran fast because it's hot, and it ran successfully. And so the reason why I can pick any HTTP method here, it doesn't really matter which. I could call head, and I can run it, and it's still going to work. That's based on the default configuration of my function, which I don't like. And so I'll show you how to change that. And so let me go back to post here. And now let me save this guy and go into these settings. So the first page here, integration. This is how you configure how the function, what the function is actually going to do. What's it take its input? What does it return as output? How can you invoke it? What kind of a route does it have? And if you're wondering what the heck is a route, route is this part at the end of a URL. So in this case, if you don't do anything by default, whatever you would have to type in here is the name of your function. But if your function has a name that you want to use a different route, maybe you want to keep your same function name on the back end because you can't rename them through their UI, but you want to expose it as a new endpoint to callers and name it something else, you can actually change that. So you can actually come in here and there's these little cool eye icons that you can hover over or click on. And so this allows you to set up the route. And so I could call this files new or whatever. And then that would be a different way I could invoke it. But I'm just going to leave it as empty so it uses the default. So this is one I always change, allow HTTP methods. I think that calls should be intentional and not WYSIWYG, or not WYSIWYG, that's not the right term, but not willy-nilly. And so what I will do is I will come into my integration tab, click on select methods, and if it's a get function, because I'm going to get data, then I'll make it so it only runs if it's invoked with the get method, if that makes sense. So that changed by itself. Before I talk about the rest here, I'm just going to click on save. And so now when I come back to files and I go on and let's say, notice that the list here cleared automatically. I had post, but it cleared. The reason why it cleared is because post is no longer valid for this guy because I specifically told it can only accept get. But it's not smart enough to pick get for me, which is just a usability thing. So if I run this with nothing, I'm pretty sure it's going to error. Let me just see. Did I click on run? Oh, yeah, it doesn't do anything. It's like, oh, I don't know what to do. And so if you see that weird, like you saw that flicker, because I don't have an HTTP method. If ever you try to run here and it just does this weird flash thing and goes away, check your test tab and see that you have an HTTP method selected. So it narrows it down so I only have the one choice. And there you see what that flash was doing. The status was 404 not found because there is no method endpoint for this guy. If I invoked this from the command line using post, I would get a 404 because there is no post method endpoint at this particular address. So that's why you can use verbs to show the stuff out. So now when I hit run, it runs and it works just fine. So I've got it configured properly for get. I should also show you this guy right here, get function URL. So on the run.ps1 file, if you click on that, this shows me what I need to do to actually run this guy. Now, I'm actually not going to copy that. You can just click on copy. Instead, I'm going to go up to my, go back to my integration tab, sorry. And, no, sorry, not there. It's in my manage tab. I'll get to that in a second. So on your manage tab, the only thing you can manage for your functions is whether the function is enabled or disabled and what keys are available to run that function. And so you've got host keys, which work for all functions inside of a single Azure function app, or you've got function keys that work for each individual function. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to add a new host key, and I will call it PS demo, and I'll leave that empty so it auto-generates, and then hit save. And so that'll make me a key, which I don't even have to show you guys, which is fun for demos, because I don't have to show you what the key looks like. I can just click on copy. Now, the fact that I show it to you doesn't really matter, because I'm going to show it to you over here in a second when I come here and I type in $key equals, and okay, everybody close their eyes and stop recording, and there we go, there's my key and CLS. You didn't see that, right? Yeah, so you have to be careful with demos, but this is just a demo environment, and so if somebody uses my key, it's not going to be a big deal. I can tear this down when I'm done the session tonight. Or I can just get rid of that one key, right? Which is great. And I can actually change any of these keys. So if you saw from the screenshot, or not the screen earlier, but when you go into files and you click on get function URL, and there is a key here, all this stuff, I don't have to worry about showing that to the world, because after this, all I need to do is go back into manage and click on renew, 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 and renew, and I'll get brand new keys. Or if I'm done with a certain one, I can just revoke it and it's gone. So this is just about, this is your credential, your key to run the function. And so I copied this guy here into my PowerShell session storage key. Under integration, I told you how I set it up as a get method. And so that's how this guy is set up over here. I'm leaving it with the default route. Inside the function, you know how we talked about, it's got request as the request. So REQ, $REQ right here. That comes directly from here. So if you don't like the name, you can change it and then just go and update your function so it uses a different name for the actual request. Personally, I just stick with the default because why change it? But you can change it if you want to. And then the authorization level that I set at the beginning, I can update it here so I can make it be anonymous if I want to, but I'll leave that as is. Mode, oh yeah. So generally speaking, you're going to do a lot of standard stuff and you might do occasionally webhook things. Webhooks are what you could pick if you are trying to create a webhook endpoint for GitHub or Slack, or a generic one for some other site other than these two, some generic JSON format for a webhook. There's support for those things. I actually haven't gone and tinkered with that yet, but there is support for that to set up that's how you set the webhook. But if you just want it to be an endpoint that you can call, then you just leave it as standard. Now I talked about inputs and outputs. A couple things here. You see the trigger. The trigger is an HTTP request that comes in on this address using a key. So it comes in on psserverless.azurewebsites.net/API/files. So that's fine. and then question mark code equals and my key. So that's how I call this guy. And that's my trigger. And if I click on that, what you're looking at here is because this guy's selected. So these are the settings for that particular trigger. I can then create additional inputs, and I can create as many outputs as I want. By default, when I picked an HTTP method, this is what I get. I get an HTTP trigger, and I'm going to send back HTTP results. And if I click on this guy, notice the change down here. Here I can see, okay, my output, my response parameter name is res, and or I can use my function return value as my response parameter. I'm not sure which way they're going to go with the final cut of this guy. I haven't gone through and done that. I've just been using res. The reason I've been using res, which you see down here, the file path that I write to, is because output for my function is my log messages. And I want my log messages. So I can do logs using write output, or I can do logs just by returning strings. And those go to my logs. So I haven't yet figured out, I haven't gone through and checked that box saying whatever I return from my function is my output. Well, then how do I do logs? That's the part I haven't gone and looked at yet. There's probably a way. I just haven't dug in on that. I haven't gone down that road yet. If you do, you want to share it, that would be great. So let me see that guy again, back where I was. So that's how I can change the output, or change the configuration of the existing outputs, and I can add new outputs or new inputs. And so if I click on new input, I can get input from Azure Blob Storage. So of course, because it's an Azure service, it integrates with other Azure services, and so I can have my my input come directly from a blob, from an external file, external table, from an Azure database table, the Azure Cosmos DB, or Azure mobile tables. I haven't used any of these, but I can, but I haven't used any of them. So that's all possibility on the inputs. And on the output side of the fence, I can output to all these different things. So I can send an output to a message queue, put output into a blob. So if I wanted to have my endpoint go and do something and then take that data and write it into an Azure storage blob, so I can refer to it later, like logging data or whatever, I can do that. I can throw files into my blob storage. I can have my output go to Azure Event Hubs and deal with eventing. An external file, external table. You can see preview and experimental. I'm not quite sure what the difference is between those two. To me, that says the same thing, but whatever, it is what it is. So there's preview mode and there's experimental mode. My output, the default is HTTP because I'm sending back an HTTP result. And so that's what this one is. And then there's service bus, table storage, Cosmos DB, mobile tables, all Azure stuff, notification hubs. I can send an SMS message using Twilio. That's pretty cool. So you can create a REST endpoint that responds to some kind of a service in the cloud and sends an SMS message to your phone, which is really neat. Or you can get into the new bot framework, which is also really neat. So deal with bots where you can hook into things like Microsoft Teams and Office 365 stuff and have bots that just do smart things and have that hooked in via some PowerShell stuff you guys write. So this is like really cool features. And there's so much you can do here. And I've only scratched the surface on it. And even though I've only scratched the surface on it, I am seeing tremendous value in the things I have built using this. So yeah, there's all sorts of things you can set up for outputs. I'm just going to click on cancel and stick with those defaults. And when you see that this is weird, why is there nothing? It's just because I don't have anything selected. I can come back and get my my settings from just by selecting one of these guys. So that's the integration. It's how it integrates with other services. So it integrates using HTTP in and out. Then management, the keys, and then monitor is the runs. And so I can come in here and look at. This always takes a second to come up. I'm not quite sure why. Look at all the runs. And so here I can see successes versus failures, how long they took to run. I can click on one, and I can go and look at the actual output that was sent. So all that logging, those write output calls, you can see that here in subsequent runs. And so if you're creating functions, if you wanted to share content in a PowerShell command with a peer, The traditional way, well, there's lots of traditional ways you might do it. You might have a UNC share in your environment you drop files into. You might have set up an internal PowerShell gallery that you drop your scripts into if you're a real go-getter and kind of savvy and do that sort of thing. Or now you could just take your code and host it in Azure and give somebody the endpoint and say, just call this guy using an invoke REST method. And so that's cool too. They don't actually have to share the code and the file and think, how do I get this into my environment and sourcing it, running it, and all that stuff. You just give them the invoke REST method. And so that's kind of neat. And so yeah, so you could see here the history of the runs. This is simple logging. This is what you get when you don't use insights. And that's why at the top of this you see for a richer monitoring experience, including live metrics, custom queries, enable application insights for your function app. That's drinking from the fire hose when it comes to tracking what's going on behind the scenes. So there's just a lot in there. So take a look at it. It's worthwhile starting to take a look at, but I would start for the first little while. Just use the basics. Don't turn on insights, and you get these log messages that you come in here. You can't come down below and see older ones than what fits on the screen here, so you don't get all that rich history inside of this UI. And this UI, by the way, does not refresh that quickly. And so if you're waiting for something, you might have to come here and click on refresh a few times because it's just a little slow to refresh. But that probably comes from this being still a relatively new feature, and so that's just the way it goes. So yeah, so now I'm just going to go and show you the external run. So I set up my key already, and so now if I come back to this guy, so I've got my base URI. So let me show you that first. Base URI. So it's PS, in my case, PS serverless.azurewebsites.net, and I'm going to run that with my key that I stored already and give it my path, and I get back results. And so now I'm calling into a REST method. So I've just written a REST method using just PowerShell and some point and click, which is great. My results, if I did the get member, I can see it's just string. Like as I mentioned, if you want JSON, then you would have to convert that to JSON, and then know you're getting back JSON, and then the unconversion would happen automatically with your invoke REST method call. But it just realizes that what it get back is string, and so it just shows it as string because it wasn't a JSON formatted block of code. But that's cool because now, as I can run this again, let me scroll down again here, and so whoops, without get member. And so now I can see, looking at the file system, d:/home/site/www root, there is a folder called files, and there's a folder called vars. And isn't that funny? Because I've got an Azure function called files and an Azure function called vars. And so if I go look at the content of those guys, I can see function.json and run.ps1. That run.ps1 is my code. So you can browse through the file system and see this run ps1 file. And my function.json is right here. You can see I've got function.json. It's got my settings. So the fact that it takes an HTTP trigger as input, and it uses REQ for the actual variable name, and its output is using HTTP with RES in the variable name, and it's not disabled. And so that's just the bindings that are set up for my function that get stored in that file. So then you get that pair automatically. So, yeah, those are the two files you get from by default. And you can see when I start browsing here, I only get to see that at the files level, but here I can browse and see so much more. If you want to upload a module in here that your function can call, note right here, I can click on upload, and then I can browse and I can upload something into this folder. So I could create a folder under here called modules, and I can upload stuff into it. Right now, the way Azure functions are implemented, they actually will look for modules in a modules folder here and try to load them. However, the way they do it is wrong. And so you can tell, I mean, the Azure Functions team does a tremendous job by doing everything they're doing, but they don't have the PowerShell expertise that is required to really make a good spit and polished PowerShell implementation, and so there are just things that aren't quite done right. Let me show you another example of. Oh yeah, so they don't use PS module path whatsoever. They just don't. I mean, there is PS module path, but they don't set up PS module path. So I would think that PS module path for my function would be automatically set up that if I have a modules folder, that modules folder would be part of my PS1 module or my PS module path. So I get auto loading, and so it just works. They don't do that. Instead, all you get by having a modules folder is the fact that you can call import module with the module name, and it'll find it. But you won't get auto loading on the content inside that module, and so that's wonky to me. I don't really like that. So I want that to change. So it's either a matter of me buckling down and getting some PRs done, or them just working with community and trying to fix these kinds of things. The other thing too, if I put a modules folder here inside of this Azure function, well, what if I want that same module to be available to this guy? This guy's got its own vars folder, and so do I have to upload my module twice? No, I don't have to. I can put it where I want to put it in my file system, that it's accessible to multiple locations, as long as I'm savvy about how I do that. And so I've got, so what I've done to work around that is actually write a function called, I'll just drag this over here to show you. So I've got this function called import local module that I will drop into my Azure function, and I will load my modules into the environment home/data/modules folder, which is where I put them is, if I go back up to, let's see, not that level, down here. Yeah, home/data. And so I don't have it right here because this is a net new Azure function deployment, but right here is where I create a modules folder, and I'll drop my modules in there, and then I will use this import local module function that manually stores the existing PS module path, adds my folder, that shared folder location to my PS module path, imports my module by name, and then resets the PS module path back to what it was before, just because I don't want to dirty the system since it's not done. This, in my opinion, they've got to make this automatic. There's just got to be a location where you drop modules. That's not there right now, so you work around it. And so this code is fairly straightforward to drop into a function, and then instead of calling import module in your function, you call import local module, and you give it the name of the module you want. Now, why you might even care about modules. So I mentioned that you might want to load modules from the gallery. You might also want to load modules because you might be using Azure RM, and you might notice that the version of Azure RM that is installed by default in the function deployment is version 1.1. something, and they're already up to 3.1. And so their fun fact, the Azure Functions infrastructure is built using a custom build of Windows. And it's running PowerShell version 4, and they can't just do a direct upgrade to PowerShell version 5 because of the fact that this custom build of Windows, customized Windows thing that they're doing, and so they so it's stuck on PowerShell version 4, and the particular package that they have that gets deployed by default for Azure RM is old. And by old, I'm talking older than 6 months, more like 9, 12 months old. It's old. And so if you want to do automation against Azure, you need to take the Azure RM package and download it locally and then copy it up into your Azure function location and do it in such a way that it's not using version numbers, right? Because PowerShell version 5 supports side-by-side modules with module folder name and then a subfolder with a version number and then the module below that. And PowerShell version 4 doesn't. And so I should probably share this guy out. I've got, do I have it open here anywhere? No. Whoops, not new. Hang on 1 second. I just want to quick find something. I've got a function that I've written. Oh yeah, right here. So update Azure module fx package. It's just a script, and I give it a module name and pass through enforce, and it goes out to the gallery and downloads the entire package and saves it locally. And Adam wants control. I'm guessing that's a mistake. And so I'm going to say no, but if you can justify it, then maybe I'll give you control. And so, yeah, so update, yeah, that's what I figured, that's fine. It was a mistake. So update Azure FX module package. It goes out to the gallery, it downloads the package of whatever module I give it. It moves it into a new subfolder structure, ships out all the version numbers, makes sure it's using the latest, and puts it into a zip file for me. I think that's right. Yeah, I can press archive. Yep. So it does all that, and then at that point I could then upload it where I want to, using some tools for uploading. So it's pretty useful function. So yeah, I've got a basic function running here now. This vars one, all I had done before, and this, you might want to create these particular functions, right? So I've got this files function, and I can send Mike the actual code for this, although it's fairly straightforward and it'd be easy for you just to take the existing boilerplate you get, and if you rewatch this video, because it's recorded, modify the few things that need to be modified, which would also probably be a decent learning experience. But I'm going to come back to my, let me move this out of the way again, to my file I was copying my scripts from, and so I've got where's variables? There it is. So very similar to my files function, I've got this vars function, and all he's going to do is very similar. Just go and call get variable and retrieve a list of variables, and it'll take in a name, and so it'll give me the variable information back. And so I can save him, and I can come over here, let me close that out, and move that to a get, because it's also a get method. And now save it again. Then I can go into, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Oh yeah, go into integrate and make sure that this is set up properly. So selected methods. In my case, it's only a get, so that's fine. Get rid of all these things. Leave the rest all as default. Save that. And now I should, I don't think I have to do, no, I don't have to do anything with manage, because I'm using a demo key that's for all functions. And so now I should, I haven't even tested this inside of Azure itself, but I should be able to come over here and simply, let's get rid of that, and let's call into vars. There we go. So that was nice and easy. So I can get my same output, and I can take a look what the variables are set inside of this environment. And that is something I think I would encourage, because just because of the differences that there are between the Azure function runtime deployment and PowerShell. You might expect certain things to be there and them not actually being there. There's a question. So when running the function under function security context, how does this translate to Azure security? You need to configure permissions for storage, Cosmos DB, etc. to receive function outputs. So that's a great question. There's two things. If you want to have a function that calls into Azure, you need to write your code in that function to actually call into Azure. So you need to actually log on to Azure programmatically and call into it. However, they have recently made that much easier. And I'm trying to remember the name of the service. What's it called? I don't think, it's not the Key Vault. There is a new service that was recently updated to allow you to give permissions for functions to make that easier, because the way it works right now is a little bit challenging. And so technically, for some of the functions I've got have some hard-coded credentials. So other ones I've written, I take in credentials as parameters. So in some tests, I've just done some hard-coded credentials, but in production ones I basically add parameters for my function to take as input. What's my subscription name, or sorry, subscription ID, tenant ID, and then username and password for Azure. and accept those as input parameters because I can have as many parameters as I want. And once I have those internally, then I can programmatically write PowerShell to log into Azure and do stuff. Does that answer your question, Alexander? Yes, it does. Tips for organizing functions, naming conventions, etc. And can you call a function from another function? Great questions. Yes, you can call a function from another function, but the way you call it is by using the REST endpoint, the invoke REST method, because you're calling into another REST endpoint. So the same way that I would call externally, I could call internally. But internally, I would use one of those keys that are internal. So going back to my UI over here, and then into these keys, I could use the master key for internal calls since it's never shared externally and call into another function, so we don't have to worry about what the key is that I use. And so that's a possibility. And then as far as naming conventions, I generally stick with just a single lowercase name because it's easier on if I'm going to call into an endpoint. It's just easier for an HTTP URL. I usually stick with lowercase, or maybe I might do mixed case, so lowercase for get capital V ARS if I wanted to call it get virus. You can use verb now if you want. I don't. I usually just come up with a name that identifies what I'm retrieving, and I use my verb is over here. And yes, this is pluralized, and PowerShell is all about non-pluralized nouns, and I totally support that. But in the case of REST APIs, you generally don't see that. You generally see pluralized stuff. So that's what I'll do for those. That's two simple functions. I mean, there's so much to cover here, and I'm only scratching the surface. And you can see as I go through all this stuff, there's really so much that you can cover. I'm having trouble. Okay, this is another question from Jim. Having trouble wrapping my head around when it would be better to use an Azure function rather than an automation runbook. Well, an automation runbook is okay. Let me think about that for a second before I answer it. I've moved away from using automation runbooks and I've moved into using Azure Functions because I like the serverless concept, because I like it only deploys and runs when I call it. That works for me, and also because the fact that I get REST APIs, so I get integration, where unless I'm mistaken, well, I suppose you can use the REST APIs to invoke a runbook and call REST that way, which would work, but then you're dealing with some credentials and not necessarily a key, and so not quite the same thing. I think that this is easier for doing REST APIs and hooking into commands that you would want accessible directly on the web than runbooks. But I say that having not spent a whole lot of time in Azure runbooks. As far as investment goes, I think that Azure Functions are going to go further. I think that there's a lot more investment and attention being put into those. And Azure runbooks and automation accounts, they've been around for a while and they're still there and they still work. But my money's on Azure Functions as a better investment for career and for general use. Great question, though. So the other things I was going to show are, and I can probably add them really quick here since it's just a matter of me copying and pasting. Let me flip over to, where my ISD go? So I had, if I wanted to create I'm going to create a new function here, and this time I'm going to use a different scenario. I'll go into PowerShell again, and I'll create a queue trigger. And so I will call my queue trigger enqueue. And so enqueue just means I'm going to add a message to a queue, and dequeue means I would process it and take it out. And I can call my queue name whatever I want. It gives me a default samples-PowerShell. I'll just use PowerShell dash message, or actually shorter, yes, dash messages. And the storage account that's going to be used to actually create and manage the queue, you can pick what you want over here. This is a demo, so it doesn't really matter. I'll just make sure I pick the same one between the two different ones. So Azure Web Storage. So I'll click on create, and so I get this queue. Now when I'm working with a queue, content is a little different on input. I'm dealing with trigger input, and then that's the messages that are coming in from my queue. If I look at my settings, you can see that matches my parameter name over here. So if I go and do something a little fancy, now this is my enqueue message. So this is actually going to, I got to make two changes here. This is the one I'm going to actually go through and write a message into a queue. But there was no template for that. It only showed me dealing with a queue as a trigger. I'm going to remove this. So I've got no trigger, and I'm going to add an output. And my output is going to be, where's queue? Queue storage. Select that. And so I'm going to write a function that's going to write out to a queue, Azure Job Storage. My queue name is going to be called PS-messages. And I'll leave that as output queue item for now. Is that what I want to write to? No, actually it's called, 1 second, I'm looking at my code in another window. Res. The result. So you could leave it as the default if you wanted to. But my function is using res, so I'm just changing it to res. So I'm going to hit save on this guy. Oh, and I'm going to do one more thing. I'm going to make it so I can actually send the message using HTTP. So I'm going to add an HTTP input. And in this case, it's going to not be a get, it'll be a post. Because I'm sending it something, I'm not getting something. I don't expect a result back, or maybe I do, but I'm just firing off a message. The rest of those can stay the same. And so I've got this is a function called enqueue. It takes input as HTTP, output is going to put a message into a queue. And now if I go and I take my function body, I can paste it here. This is what my function body is, which is longer. This basically just pulls out the caller IP address. Sort of, it's not perfect logic, but it sort of does it. Trying to see if there's more questions. No, none yet. These are my inputs of my parameters. So I've got an ID parameter and I've got an action parameter, both that are going to come in as part of the action or URL using this reg query format. So I don't have to, if you ever take a parameter, I said I was going to talk about this earlier, and now I'm getting to it now. So let me move this up. When you're going to call a method like, I'm going to go back a ways to get to it, like this one, where I pass in a couple of parameters on the command line. I've got ID and I've got action. And this is going to go in, and I want to process it internally, and I want to get those values. The format used to get those is $request, not reg, sorry, REQ, request underscore query underscore whatever that piece is, action or ID or whatever. And so this request query ID refers to whatever the value is here that I give it. And this request query action refers to whatever the value is here that I type in on my command line. And so I'm going to take an input, and all I'm going to do is write a message to a queue. And the way I do that is by sending output using outFile again, because the PowerShell implementation of Azure Functions uses files for output. And so I'm sending it out to res, just like I would have if I was using HTTP output. But in this case, excuse me, I'm sending output to a queue, and the message I'm going to send is just a single string that's got action, space, and then the identifier. So let me save that. So that's my enqueue message, so I can receive messages and write them into a queue. And now the partner to that, I'm going to click on Add, and go back into PowerShell, and queue trigger, and I'll call this DQ. And messages, where are messages useful? The reason why I started getting really interested in queues and messages is because one of the first things that I decided to integrate with using Azure Functions was a product that would send a blocking call to a REST endpoint if you gave it one, if you configured it to make a blocking call. And by blocking call, I means it would call into that endpoint, wait for that to return, and then keep on doing stuff. and I wanted to take action on those calls without it blocking. And so the perfect solution for that is a queue, because I can make the call from my product I'm integrating with, call into a queue to write the message, and then it's done. And so that's very quick. Writing a message to a queue is pretty much instantaneous, no blocking necessary. It just goes and puts the message in the queue, and then it says, okay, I'm done, you can keep on running. And then I've got another Azure function that watches that queue for messages, and it pops them off the queue and then does work internally. And what that allowed me to do was to take something that was would execute synchronously and make it execute asynchronously, just by using a message queue to break up so there was no wait. So I just basically, the caller adds something to the queue and returns, and somebody immediately grabs it off the queue and starts doing things while the caller is still, that function or the product integrated with is still doing things. So that's one really good example where queues come into play. And so if I do ps-messages again here, and the same storage account. So this is my DQ function, and the body of DQ is actually really simple. Pretty much what you see here, just slightly changed. I just removed the -raw because I didn't want a new line on the end of the file. And so this is using get content to pull content from a file. The file is trigger input. That input comes from the parameters of the integration over here, trigger input. So it reads content from a file, and then it writes output to my log saying, I got a queue message, and here's what the message was. So now that I've done that, I can come over here, and I should just be able to run this guy. And because, okay, there we go. It fired and returned, so that's great. So now, let me come to enqueue, and that was my first invocation. Go into monitor, and oh, it's because I had this guy created a few hours ago. It's got some logs stored. It's because I had created a serverless Azure function, and then I tore it down, and then I recreated it, and so it's picking up my old logs, which is interesting. Maybe even a little bit questionable, but that's okay. I'm not going to go too far with that. So it ran, I think. Now I'm just trying to refresh here and see it show up, and I'm not seeing anything yet. Let me check if there's questions. So none right now. There it is. So here's my run, and if I look at that, I can see PowerShell script added the message create 1701 to queue, and sure enough, when I called it with create and ID 1701. So that puts the message in the queue, and it returned immediately. And my DQ, if I come over here and go to monitor, and again, I've got to refresh this guy, the message goes onto the message queue, and if I hook this up properly, which I should double check that I used the proper PS message. Uh-oh. Whoops. Save. And so I had the wrong queue name, so it didn't fire off right off the bat. I'm actually going to fire off a second call here just to get things going more. So let's do create 1989. And actually, let's do delete because that's the other one that I allow. So fire that guy off. And so if I refresh here, I want to see when things start getting picked up. This guy should have it 2 minutes ago. That's the create. Like I mentioned, you have to be patient with these for stuff to show up. I'm not sure why the logs take a while to get there. When the functions run quick, I would expect the logs to go pretty much right off the bat, but it takes a while. There it is. So that's my delete, and monitor a few seconds ago, delete 1989. Sure enough, there it is. And a minute ago, there's my create. So it works. So I've got invoke REST method calling into an Azure function. That Azure function writes a message into a queue. Another guy looks at the queue and triggers when that queue message is in there and pops it off the queue and then does something with it. So that's another way you can do integration without calling from one Azure function to another. Question from Adam: are long-running functions an issue? Maybe. The default timeout you get for an Azure function is 5 minutes. You can bump that to 10. I haven't had to. but I mean, as far as coding goes, that's a decent amount of time depending on what you're doing. But that says basically try to keep your function payloads small-ish and not big and monolithic, because in 5 minutes, but that's your default, it'll time out. But you can bump it up to 10 if you really need to. Beyond that, if you need more than that, you'd have to reach out to the Azure Function team, who are very, very responsive if you go chat with them over on this issues page or on Twitter. A good resource is is that the right name? No, that's not her, but well, I have her name, but it's not the right one. So I'd have to find it again. There is a tolling is PM. I think I've got her actually on this thread. Yeah, right here. So she's one of the PMs for Azure Functions, dealing with the PowerShell side of the fence, and she's very, very responsive to questions. So that's longer than I thought it was going to be, but that's good because I got to cover a lot of content that I think is going to be pretty valuable to you. Now, I'm looking around here. There we go. Back to my environment. So, other questions? I know here it's 12:13. I mean, I'm not in a rush. It's 12:13 in the morning, so it's getting late for you guys too. After 10 p.m., I saw a few people had to drop off. Further reading that I would recommend. Great question. If you go to, I'll put this in the chat session. GitHub.com/Azure/Azure-Functions. So let me copy that. This link right here, this is the centralized page for anything and all the repos related to Azure Functions. So this gives you a lot of getting started, points you to some resources and documentation page. This also gives you places to file issues if you find bugs. And these go into different Azure repositories because there are multiple teams involved here. Also questions and feedback, the forum, Stack Overflow tag, follow Azure Functions on Twitter, and you can send them. They're responsive as well, so that's useful for if you have issues. But so this is, I mean, you can see there's a ton of links in here: documentation, overview, concepts. There's a lot of really, really good information inside of here. You can also check out Doug Fink's blog, which is I should know off the top of my head. I was just there today. Did he redo his blog? Yeah, he did. He's on GitHub.io now. So dfink.github.io. So here's a post he just did about using serverless PowerShell to extend Slack. PowerShell and Azure Functions to form a scheduled cleanup task. So you can see some examples here that he's posted. I thought he had something newer than this. So that's why I'm wondering if that's his latest. It's not on his Twitter feed. So if you check out his Twitter feed, there is there it is. Rapidly deploy serverless Azure Functions using PowerShell. Oh, that's why I wasn't finding it. It's not on his blog. He just did a blog. Thank you, Mike. He just did a post on the MVP Award Program blog, and it's talking about the module I mentioned that he has for deploying Azure-less functions, or Azure-less functions, that's funny, serverless functions to Azure using a PowerShell module. That talks about that blog post that Mike just dropped into the chat session talks specifically about that, and so that's a good resource. So I think beyond all these, this is a good foundation, and then just start asking questions. Reach out to me on Twitter at Pashaholic. Or go in Stack Overflow and ask a broader audience, or tag myself and Doug Fink, people who have been working with Azure Functions. Mike mentioned that he's done some stuff with them, and see if we can chase down the answers to the questions you have if you're stuck. Other questions?
I was just going to say this was a great session, Kirk, and I'm glad we recorded it because I'm going to go back through it and watch the recording and actually do some of this stuff in Azure.
That's great. Yeah, I'm glad you recorded it too, because I know sometimes I do talks and people don't get to record them, and I think there's enough content in here and it's enough new that it'll be worthwhile to rewatch and take a look at that content that's there and try to start producing some of these things. Because, I mean, these were all, one thing I don't like doing too much in demos is demos that really don't mean much, but I wanted to focus this talk on how to create these things and talk about like reasons why you might do it, more than focus on complicated PowerShell scripts that do things. I want to just kind of focus on the basics. So I think that makes sense for this. Yeah, so I'm using them a lot. Doug thinks is using them a lot. They're great fun. There are lots of scenarios for them, and I strongly encourage, like I mentioned at the beginning, you guys to give them a look and see if they fit into your workflow, or at least have an idea of what they do so that you'll recognize when there are opportunities to fit them into your workflow. And other than that, thanks for hanging out and sticking around so late. I do appreciate it.
Thank you for presenting.
My pleasure, anytime.
All right, well, I think I'm going to go ahead and drop off, guys. So thank you again, Kurt. It was awesome.
My pleasure, and good chatting with you guys again. And if I don't get to do a talk with you again beforehand, I hope I get to see you at the PowerShell and DevOps Summit.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're planning on going?
I'm not sure yet. I'm hoping to. I'm going to try.
Okay. Well, hopefully that works out. So thanks again, everyone. I'm going to sign it as well. It's now 12:19 here. I need to go get some sleep, and so I'm functional tomorrow. So have a great one. And Mike, if you're looking for another speaker, I don't think you're working out next year yet. We can talk about that at some point, and I can come up with another topic, or go deeper on this and do go further than what I did here, or whatever works for you.
Sounds good. Yeah, we're booked up the remainder of the year, which is just a couple more months, and then we haven't had a call for speakers yet for next year.
Okay. Well, I'll keep an eye out for that, and then chat with you about that when it comes up.
Sounds good. Thank you again. Have a great night.
My pleasure. Thanks, guys.
All right.